Okay. I hadn't actually prepared anything for this month, and so I was going to do a repeat of a talk I'd given a couple of years ago, at least 2 or 3 years ago. And when I looked at the one that I thought I would do, I realized I could add a bit more to it. So this is actually an updated version of a talk I did a couple of years ago with a bit more thrown in. So where are we? Presenter view. So this one is about some gentlemen who lived and worked in the area around the Williamson buildings at the top of Paddington. There's the Linacre family, George Lunt and Co., the flour millers, and William Boote, the grocer, and then Charles Hand, the historian. And they're all connected very closely with this set of buildings at the top of Paddington, as I've talked about many, many times before. These were built around 1836 to 1840, and from about the early 1840s, right up until about 1900, this building at the top of the street, number 126 Paddington, the top one of the block of 4 buildings, was occupied by George Lunt, the flour millers. We know it as number 126 Paddington. Not that the building's there anymore, but up here it says number 118 because these buildings were renumbered several times through the years. And this was the baker's shop of George Lunt and Co. with flour storage probably in the upper floors, and the deep basements, and then the enormous great quarry below that goes down 60 feet. And we're led to believe by the writings of a man I'm going to talk about in a few minutes that in the basement underneath George Lunt's bakery here, the first level of the cellars, because there were 2, leading across the street that way, across the end of Highgate Street, were several tunnels. And within those tunnels were the bakery ovens used by George Lunt and Co. We never found them, unfortunately, because the top level of the cellar system had been destroyed when the Williamson buildings were demolished. We only have the second level of cellars below. So we never found the evidence of these tunnels going under the street here, or the bakery ovens that had been in them. I would have loved to have seen those, really, but there you go, we've lost them. Just around the corner from the Williamson buildings here into Highgate Street, we have another man who's very closely associated with these buildings, or rather, more complicated than that. It's 3 generations of a family called George Linacre. And George Linacre had his business just around the corner, tucked in behind the Williamson block of buildings at number 2 Highgate Street. This is an early version of some of his paperwork, house and shop number 2 and 2A Highgate Street. And this will be from the first generation George Linacre, a man who was born in the 1830s. He moved to Mason Street at one point, started his business, and then he later moved up to the next street up the hill, which was Highgate Street, and he was becoming quite successful, employing about 5 people in his business. General plumber, painter and decorator, bricklaying, slating, plastering, general jobbing builder, I would say. And this is a rather nice pen and ink drawing from some of his stationery. And this was obviously designed for him, or even by him, I don't know, probably in the mid-1800s. You can see by the dress code of these people here and the horse and carriage that this was quite early. And yet the funny thing is that he was still using, or the family were still using this stationery right up until the 1940s, even though it was completely outdated. So here's number 2, Highgate Street, the home of George Linacre and his family. And this is his sort of office out on the street. And it's all tucked in right behind the block of Williamson buildings, with the top one at the top of the street here being George Lunt's bakery. And this business moved through 3 generations, and they were all called George Linacre, which made it very difficult to work out the sequence and the storyline of these three generations. They were still in business up into the 1940s. And this particular version of the letterhead shows number 5 Highgate Street. They're still using this particular pen and ink drawing, even though the Williamson buildings in Paddington had been demolished in 1939. And Mr. Linacre's home at number 2 Highgate Street and all the rest of Highgate Street on that side and between there and Mason Street had all been demolished through the 1930s. And he'd obviously moved to another house on the other side of the street, which was number 5 Highgate Street. By this time, we're looking at the third generation of George Linacres, because it's become a limited company now. And George Linacre is one of the 3 directors. Now, this man was called George Elvey Linacre, and he had 2 younger sisters, and they were named, what are they? Beatrice Marion Linacre and Lillian Tunstall Linacre. So that's where we have the BM Linacre and LT Linacre. They were his younger sisters in the last stage of the George Linacre business here in Highgate Street and Paddington. And it's the second generation of George Linacre that I'm particularly interested at this minute. I'm going to leave you looking at that picture while I read you something. By a stroke of luck, a lovely piece of writing came our way in 2002, I believe, and I still have no idea where it came from, who supplied it to us, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was a later member of the Linacre family. It's only a single page rather, and it's by the second generation, a man called George Herbert Linacre, who was running the business after his father. And he's written a little bit here, which is very misleading. He's picked on other things that have been written about Joseph Williamson, which are completely wrong. He's just picked up hearsay, and he stated something silly like Joseph Williamson arrived in the Edge Hill district in 1700, which is rubbish, because Joseph Williamson wasn't born until 1769, and he didn't come up to Edge Hill until about 1806. But anyway, the later piece is much more interesting and factual, I think. And he's written down here, number 120 to 124 Paddington was occupied by William Boote, a grocer. The writer had occasion in 1898 to go into the basement of Boote's. The bottle washing department was in a bricked arch tunnel 2 stories below the actual basement of the shop. There are 3 or 4 tunnels about 10 feet high and 30 feet long. The end of one was bricked up. In later years, the writer had the opportunity to explore further. With companions, he cut through the brickwork, found a stone staircase, and descended into a murky passage and to further tunnels. In the lowest one, they had to stoop and found that they were walking on solidified stout. That is very relevant, and I'll mention that again later. Walking in solidified stout. At 126 Paddington, which was the top building of the block of 4, which was Lunt's the baker's, the arrangement was different. This was the bakery of George Lunt. From the ground floor, stone steps went down into a well-ventilated basement. The bakehouse was in the basement, and from it led several tunnels extending 12 feet or so under the roadway. These were used as ovens. So that's a really telling little piece of writing, which I can believe completely, even though he got some facts wrong earlier on. But it does tell us that basically there were 2 deep cellar systems side by side within the block of 4 buildings, and we only have access to this one underneath number 126 Paddington at the top of the street, and there is another completely separate basement under the other part of the building, which is backed up by another piece of writing that I'm going to read out later. So the next gentleman to talk about here is this man, William Boote. As just mentioned, William Boote was a grocer, a very enterprising man. He came to operate in 3 of the Williamson buildings out of the 4. That's number 120, 122, and 124 Paddington, all of them except the George Lunt Bakery. And he operated there from about 1867 right up until 1905 when he retired. And we have a rather interesting entry here from a trade directory. I've done all this before, but it's worth repeating. One of our volunteers has a copy of this book, which goes back to sometime in the 1880s, I believe, although I can't see a date on this. I've never actually seen the book myself, but I've got 3 photographs of 2 pages in the book. This one, which is the inside cover, it's obviously a trade directory. Liverpool of today, the maritime metropolis of the world, an epitome of results, businessmen and commercial interests, wealth and growth. And I believe this to be a trade directory for people who pay for an entry and gives them a voice to talk about their businesses and shout about them in lovely Victorian tones. So this is the page, the extract from this book, Liverpool of Today, concerning William Boote, the grocer, who was in business with about 10 shops around town, but this is where he was based. This was his main center of operations. And I'm going to read some of this because I think it's interesting, but I don't want to leave you looking at that page. So I'll leave you looking at the buildings, and you can imagine what was going on underneath the buildings while I read this. So, William Boote, dealer in tea, coffee, Italian goods, wines and spirits, ale and porter, bottler, and mineral water manufacturer, at number 120, 122, 122A, and 124 Paddington, Old Post Office Place, and Back Mason Street. Back Mason Street was another building right behind the Williamson block. I'm afraid I have no idea what 122A means, but it's all part of the same block. W. Boote is one of the most enterprising and successful men of business in Liverpool. In addition to the extensive premises occupied by him in Breck Road, he has 8 other large establishments in different parts of the city. His offices and wholesale sale room are at 120 Paddington. He has a very commodious coffee roasting and grinding warehouse at 122 Paddington, and tea blending rooms, warehouses, and country department at 122A Paddington. And 124 Paddington is the retail tea and coffee sale room. W. Boote has also a very large mineral water and ale and porter, wine and spirit bottling stores in Back Mason Street. His mineral water factory is one of the finest and most complete buildings of its kind in Liverpool. It's complete with the latest and best inventions in machinery that modern science can furnish for the production of all kinds of table waters and fruit champagnes in the purest form. Perfect cleanliness is secured as the machinery is so arranged that every drop of water must of necessity be filtered. The interior of the machinery with which the water comes into contact is lined with pure silver, and the plungers of the pumps made of glass in order to prevent the contamination or oxidation of the metal that takes place in the use of ordinary machinery. Every article used in the manufacture of W. Boote's drinks is tested in the laboratory before being put into stock. This close attention to detail and general excellence of material and machinery is a prevailing characteristic in all W. Boote's establishments. His coffees are roasted and ground fresh every morning on the premises by patent process with the latest and most approved machinery driven by steam power. Tea blending with W. Boote is a science. His stock in bond and duty paid is large and varied, comprising about 50 or 60 different kinds, which enables him to cater for the most fastidious. The increasing demand for his popular Ceylon blends has necessitated the erection of a motive power tea mixer, which thoroughly blends half a ton of tea in 1 minute. And during the entire process of transfer from the original packages, of mixing in exact and judicious proportions, and storing in specially constructed airproof bins, the tea is preserved from contact with the atmosphere and all handling rendered unnecessary. This method ensures thorough cleanliness and uniform flavour, and each leaf retains its original bloom, its strength, its flowery tip, and its fragrant freshness. W. Boote holds the highest analytical testimony of the absolute purity and refreshing properties of his blends. He could only have written this himself. Wonderful bit of writing. In the cellars, which we shall allude to presently, is carried on the ale and porter bottling, and everything that science can produce and ingenuity suggest to secure thorough cleanliness in operation. Right in the centre of the warehouse is the hoist, which works from the cellars to the top story. We've seen evidence of this hoist when we were opening up Paddington, when we first discovered it. Within the last few months, W. Boote has put down printing machinery, which enables him to do all his own printing, including labels, invoice forms, tea papers, window bills, and plain and fancy work of every description. Also, we may mention, paper bags are made on this story in adjoining rooms. And in fact, he was producing a weekly newspaper at one time, which was just a means of advertising, which he probably had people delivering door to door around Edge Hill. Lost my place now. The premises where all this business is carried on are very remarkable, being erected many years ago by rather an eccentric gentleman named Mr. Joseph Williamson, or as he was known to the neighbourhood, the King of Edge Hill, who took great delight in building arches underground. This building is 5 stories, and the cellars from the street parapet are as deep as the building is high. The tiers of splendidly arched cellar, one over the other, exhibit skills of workmanship and masonry rarely met with. The roof is flat, with an immense cistern which contains many tons of water and is always full, there being no way of running it out. The cistern rests on the centre wall of the building. The building is erected in one of the highest parts of the town, and from the roof, the whole of Liverpool and surrounding country can be seen. And on a clear day, it's a beautiful sight to look over Bidston Hill on the Cheshire side and see the vessels gliding majestically through the glassy waters of the Mersey. I think that's a fantastic piece of writing. I never get tired of reading it. But anyway, it gives you an idea of what was going on in these premises, 3 of the 4 buildings, for many, many years. And it never ceases to amuse me and please me that while we were digging out the Paddington cellars of whatever it was, 1,800 tons of material and 159 skipfuls that we took out, we uncovered so many things that were completely relevant to Mr. William Boote and his operation in Paddington. This beautiful flagon, quite a heavy thing, about 2 foot high, is sitting there on level 2 in Paddington, and I mention it to every single visitor who comes in. William Boote, Paddington, Liverpool, written on it there. And there's another one, W. Boote, Liverpool. That's a soda siphon, incomplete, but it's one of many that would have been going backwards and forwards, being refilled and out to customers and coming back again thousands of times. And then these things, the cod bottles, designed by Hiram Codd in the 1870s, I think. Many of these still survive intact. W. Boote written on there, Liverpool written on there. And we found lots and lots of these, and they're always a source of amusement to our visitors, and it's great for us explaining how and why they've developed and how they work. And besides that, there were tons and tons of broken ones, and I don't know how many tons of broken green half imperial pint glass beer bottles. And the reason why Mr. George Linacre, when he went down into the lowest levels of the cellars below here, was walking around in congealed stout, no doubt, is because they were bottling beers in here from kegs and barrels for so many years, and there would have been runoff and there would have been spillages, and they probably just let it go, and it all collected in the bottom levels. So congealed stout to walk around in. And this was not the cellar that we're in. This is the one next door. The next man I want to talk about is this one. And he's the man who actually led us, I think, more than anybody, to actually rediscover these lost cellars in 1999. This is Mr. Charles Hand. He was a local man. He lived in this area all his life. He had his own printing business just a few doors down the road from the Williamson block on Paddington. And I think he was in business in Paddington from about 1881 right up until he retired in 1928. And he had always been interested in these Williamson buildings. He recalled how, as a small boy with friends, he used to go into these Williamson buildings on a regular basis on a Saturday morning to explore with his mates. I'm not quite sure how they got in, whether they were allowed in or not, but they used to go in on a regular basis. He was always fascinated by these buildings, strange buildings, and the cellars underneath them. And later in life, he became a serious historian, a local historian, and he became a member of an organisation called the Historic Society of Lancashire and Cheshire. He wrote 2 papers on Joseph Williamson after doing as much research as he could on everything to do with Williamson and his underground spaces. And he wrote a paper in 1926, which went into the journal and was there for us to find in the archives. And at some point in November 1926, he, at a meeting of the local members of the Historic Society, he read out this paper that he'd written. And when he read it out, a lot of these members got rather interested in the story and wanted to see what it was he was talking about. So he organised a visit. And he wouldn't have had any trouble doing this because all of the people who occupied the Williamson buildings, this is after William Boote's time, but he would have been familiar with all the people who occupied the buildings. And he wouldn't have had any trouble getting permission to bring a party of visitors in to have a look around the cellars, which he did. And this happened on a Saturday morning of the 13th of November, 1926. And for some reason, he invited the Liverpool Daily Post to send a reporter along. I'm very glad that he did, because it meant there was a story for us to find in the archives. And this is the party from the Historic Society of Lancashire and Cheshire in the second level of cellars that we're very, very familiar with. And there was a lot of rubble already being thrown down in this place. They couldn't actually go down as far as we can go down now. A lot of the areas were just not possible to get into, but they explored as much as they could. And the paper that appeared, sorry, the story that appeared in the Liverpool Daily Post on the Monday morning of the 15th of November was a total exaggeration of the facts, but it was a good story. He reported that they were stumbling around in this nightmare maze of tunnels and passages, and they walked for a mile without finding an end to it. Absolute rubbish. But it was an interesting story, and it got us interested when we found this in the newspaper archives. And of course, it set us off trying to see if we could rediscover this place, which had been lost for well over 60, possibly 70 years. There's a second photograph here, which is of the same party in 1926, standing on the staircase. This gentleman here is standing in the doorway to the level 2 cellar, which was this one here. Doorway is off to the right. And this gentleman here is standing at the base of the stairs that come down through 2 levels of cellars to this point, and this staircase leads on down to the 3rd level and the 4th level. So they were interesting photographs to have, but poor quality, grainy versions out of the newspaper. And then, of course, in 1999, July 1999, we managed to break in, rediscovered this place, and we were lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time when one set of buildings had been demolished and another one was just being built, but we were allowed on the land. And we broke in through this brick arch here, dropped a ladder down, and found ourselves in this same cellar system. And in fact, this is exactly the same spot where Charles Hand and his party were standing to be photographed by the reporter from the Liverpool Daily Post. And this is the actual hole where we broke in, and this is a group of our members and volunteers posing in the same spot as had been done in 1926. There are people here I know, of course, Claire Moorhead, Steve Moran, Les Coe, Tom Murgatroyd, a couple more I don't know. But take note of this man here. He is not one of ours. He is a specially invited guest, and I'll talk about him again in a moment. There, we've been trying to reproduce the same photograph on the stairs from 1926, but of course, at this point, there's no question of standing on the staircase. Tons and tons of rubble pouring down here, down below to the third level. There's that man again. I'm going to talk about him in a moment. So, a rather interesting story happened, a rather interesting coincidence, which I think is a great piece of luck for us, basically. It turns out that there were 4 generations of George Linacre. The 3 I've spoken about already, who ran the plumbing, decorating, jobbing, builders business around the corner. But the 4th generation of George Linacre is this man here. The business fizzled out in around in the middle of the 1940s. They were still working in the 1940s. We've got bits of letterheads and invoices where George Linacre Company have been doing bomb damage repair work, replacing windows and things like that in houses that have been affected by bombing. So we know they were still in operation into the 1940s and during the war. But I think soon after that, the business seems to have fizzled out. The family moved away. I think they were in Crosby or somewhere like that. And then eventually the rest of the family moved off to live in the Preston area. And this George Linacre here, the 4th generation of George Linacre, of course, was never involved in the business. He was only 2 years old at the time when the party in 1926 went down into these cellars. But I think he would have known these cellars because his father had taken on number 126 Paddington in later years in the 1930s. And so he probably went into these cellars himself at that time. But of course, he was never involved in the business. And he was able to tell us something really interesting. What happened was, just a few days after we discovered a way into this site, and there was very little area that we could actually move around in down here because there was so much rubble filling all the chambers. Just a few days after this, we had a visit from an organization called Subterranea Britannica that we're very closely involved with. They're an organization for people who are nutcases for all underground kind of structures, man-made and natural. And we're closely associated with them. And on this particular occasion in July 1999, they'd been invited up for a visit, and a group of about 40 of them came up from different parts of the country and congregated here in Liverpool. And we acted as their hosts and showed them around some of the Williamson tunnels that were accessible, probably including the banqueting hall under Williamson's house, and others down at the stable yard. And we hosted them while we organised for them to be able to see other underground spaces in the local area. Of course, it was absolutely out of the question for them to see what we just found. The only way in was through a very small hole with a ladder, and only slim people could even think about trying to get through there. And we hadn't had time to do any work. So they didn't get to see this, but we did tell them about it. No doubt we told them about it. And just by sheer fluke, one of this group of about 40 who came down here on that day was Mr. George Linacre, down from Preston. And he was a member of Subterranea Britannica. Absolutely amazing. And he was able to tell us that he knew that his father and his grandfather had been in there in 1926 as part of this visit. And a little while later, just a few weeks later, I believe, after we'd had the opportunity to do a little bit of clearance work and make a more convenient way into the cellars, we invited George Linacre IV to come back on a personal visit to see us and to be taken down into the Paddington cellars for the first time since he was probably quite a small boy. And he came back and he brought with him the copies of the original photographs of that visit. And they were far better, of course, than the grainy photocopies that we had from the newspaper archives. And he was able to tell us more. We know that this man is Mr. Charles Hand, who organised the visit. This man, I believe, is Robert Gladstone. He was related to William Gladstone, the Victorian Prime Minister. And George was able to tell us that his father and his grandfather and an aunt were all members of the Historic Society as well. And when this party came down in 1926, they were part of it. He was able to identify that this man here with the white collar and the flat cap was his father, George Elvey Linacre. We would never have known this. We would never have known who any of these people were. He also said that his grandfather was here too. And I'm going to make the assumption that his grandfather may have been one of these two older gentlemen who had retired by that time. Could be wrong, but very likely that one of these two was George Herbert Linacre, who was the man who wrote that little piece about going in there in 1898. And this lady here was his aunt. His aunt, presumably, or quite possibly, was the sister of his father, George Elvey Linacre, who presumably would have been one of the two directors with him in the firm. So we wouldn't have known anything about any of this if George Linacre hadn't been a member of Subbrit, hadn't have chosen to be part of that visit to Liverpool on that day, and we hadn't have just happened to have rediscovered a way into Paddington. Just a wonderful coincidence. I can't believe it to this day. I wish I'd been around at the time. And on that visit, got a couple of other photos that I've recently unearthed from the archives that I've been sitting on for a long time. This is George here sitting on the surface. Right behind him is the way we've created an entrance, just about where the original staircase went down into the cellar system. He's sitting here with Claire Moorhead, our long-time treasurer and membership secretary. Les Coe's there. Chris Isles, looking very young behind. Tom Murgatroyd, no longer with us. And this gentleman I never knew. And Claire looks as if she's probably got the copies of the newspaper articles from 1926 spread on her lap and discussing it with George. And there's a photo of George standing in the opening where we later created our proper entranceway into the Paddington cellars. I don't know whether he's on his way down or on his way up. It would have been quite difficult still getting in there, but at least it was possible by ladder without going through a hole in the roof. In fact, it will be several ladders, actually. This will be just the top ladder of a set of 3 or 4 that would take him down into the lower levels. He wouldn't have seen very much, as we didn't at that time, but it took us another 13 years before we were even allowed to start clearing it out. And that is the story of how these people, George Lunt, George Linacre family, William Boote and Charles Hand, all sort of conspired to help us find out everything we've managed to find out about these Paddington cellars and what went on down there in years past. So that's about all I've got to say about him.